Welcome to Lesson 40, which roughly covers pages 240 to 248 of the Automate the Boring Stuff with Python textbook. In this lesson, we'll learn how to write programs that pull information off of web pages. This is known as web scraping. It'll help if you know HTML and CSS selectors already. There are links to tutorials for these in the course notes, but there's also a way that you can get the browser to figure out the CSS selector for you, and we'll go over that in this lesson. When your browser downloads a web page, it's downloading a plain text file formatted as HTML. HTML sounds a bit cryptic. It stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Yeah, I'm guessing that didn't clarify things. Basically, HTML is the text that tells the browser how to make the web page look. You can see the HTML for any web page by pressing Ctrl-U in your browser or right-clicking the page and selecting View Source. HTML is mostly text, with these angle bracketed things called HTML elements. Bring up the developer tools in your web browser. On Chrome and Firefox, this is done by pressing F12. You can hover over the HTML in the Elements pane, and it'll point out what part of the page this HTML is responsible for. Alternatively, you can right-click on a part of the page and select Inspect Element, and that'll bring up the HTML element for that piece of the page that you clicked on. And this will be useful when we need to pull information off of a website. Now, the request module handles downloading the web page itself, but that just gets us this huge string of text of the page's HTML. In order to locate the text we need inside this huge string, we need to parse the HTML. The third-party module Beautiful Soup makes this easy. And Beautiful Soup is a third-party module, so you have to install it by running pip install Beautiful Soup 4. To see if the install worked, type import bs4, and if there are no error messages, then the module has been installed successfully. Notice that even though the name of the module is Beautiful Soup, the name that you use to import it is BS4. This stands for the fourth version of Beautiful Soup. So let's work through an example of web scraping the price information off of an Amazon page. So we want our Python script to download this web page and then find this price information. So I'm going to first copy this URL. And we've imported the Beautiful Soup module, but we'll also need to import requests, which we covered in the last lesson, and this will handle the actual downloading. And we'll call the raise4status method, just to make sure everything worked. And nothing happened, so that means there were no problems. And no exceptions were raised by this function, so that means there were no problems downloading this website. And now we'll have to call the BS4 module's Beautiful Soup function and pass it the HTML text that we've downloaded. This will be in res.text. And this will return a Beautiful Soup object, so let's just save that in a variable named soup. Oh, whoops. Be sure to spell Beautiful Soup correctly. Now, a warning will show up because there have been some additions to the Beautiful Soup module, and in fact it can parse HTML but also several other different things. So it'll assume that we do want to parse HTML when we call this Beautiful Soup function. Now, this warning won't crash our program or anything, it just looks really ugly, so to hide this, we would just have to pass html.parser as the second argument. And this will tell Beautiful Soup, yes, we do want to parse HTML. You could also not pass this and just simply ignore this ugly warning. So a warning is not an exception in Python. So this soup object that we have is now ready to find HTML elements in the web page that we downloaded. The main way we do this is with the select method, and we pass it a string of the CSS selector for the element or elements that we want to look at. Now, CSS selector syntax, if you've ever done CSS before, you've already used CSS selectors. They're kind of like regular expression syntax, but CSS selectors answer the question of how do I specify a particular part of the HTML document that I want to look at? And you could look at the HTML yourself and figure it out if you've already learned this syntax, or you can have the browser figure it out for you. So let's just right-click on this price information right here and select Inspect Element. And so this will show you that this span element is the HTML element that contains that price text, that $22.86. So to get a CSS selector for this span element, you can right-click on the element and select Copy CSS Path. If you use browsers other than Chrome, this might be Copy CSS Selector or Copy Unique Selector or something like that. But just copy it, and that'll be copied to the clipboard, and then we'll paste it into our code. And so this is the address of that span element that contains the price. And what select does is it returns a list of all these element objects for all the matching elements. And since this is a unique selector that we gave, there will only be one element in this list. So let's save this to a variable called elems. So elems is just a list. It'll contain one element object. So we'll just use the 0 index to get that element. And each of these element objects, just like the request's response objects, has a member variable called text. And text just holds a string value of the text inside that HTML element. You can see right here it has a bunch of new lines and the price inside of this. You can see this right here. There's a bunch of tab characters and new lines and just white space characters. So that's kind of messy. Let's just let's call this strip string method. We've seen that before. And this will return a new string without all of this white space characters on either side of the string. And that returns $22.86. So we've just written Python code that downloads a website and finds information for us. Let's put all of this together inside of a single program. I'm going to click on File, New File, and let's take this from the top. So we're going to have to import BS4 and also requests. And let's create a function called getAmazonPrice. And we just pass this a string of the product's URL. And this function will return the price of the product. So when we call this later on, say getAmazonPrice, we pass it the URL of the product we want, and this will return some price information. I'll store that in a price variable, and then we can do whatever we want with that price information. I'll just print it out to the screen. So the price is, and use string concatenation, just concatenate this and then print it out. So we want this function to return a string of the price. That's pretty simple. That's basically all the steps that we've done already. So let's put them all into this function. So first, we use requests to download that page. Then we'll just call raise for status. So if there was some sort of problem downloading this, it'll raise an exception and crash our program. Next, we want to create a soup object by calling the beautiful soup function and passing it the HTML text of that web page we've downloaded. That'll be in the text variable of the response object. And then we'll call the select method. We'll just pass it this CSS selector, which we originally got just from the web page by right-clicking on that price, selecting Inspect Element, then right-clicking on the element and getting the CSS path for it. This will return a list of matching elements for that CSS selector. We only want the first one in there, and that element object will also, just like how response objects happen to also have a member variable called text that contains their content, element objects also have a variable called text, coincidentally, that contains the text inside that HTML element. And it had a lot of white space on either side of it, so let's just call the strip string method on the string inside of text. And so that'll give us that $22 string. So we want our function to just return that. So let's go ahead and test this out. Oh, wait, I almost forgot. This beautiful soup function, just to make sure that that ugly warning message doesn't show up, we'll just pass html.parser to it. Alright, so let's test this out. I'm going to save this as example.py, and I'll press F5 to run it. And that worked. So behind the scenes of this really simple print function call that just displays this text, our program went to the Amazon website, downloaded the web page, it parsed the HTML of that web page looking for the price, and then that function returned this price, which we then just passed it along to print out, oh, the price of that is $22.86. Now just imagine if you had 100 things that you needed to check the price on every day just to see if they changed or not. If you did that by hand, you would have to go through every single product on this website over and over, writing down all the prices. That would be a bit of a pain, but now we have a function. We just pass it the URLs, and we could just run this program to download all these hundreds or even thousands of product prices and just look at the prices there. So if we had hundreds or thousands of product URLs, we would just call get Amazon price for each of them, and that would return the price for us. We wouldn't have to touch the web browser ourselves at all. Now, this code won't work on every Amazon page. It's very dependent on exactly how Amazon's formats the HTML of their web pages. If they ever update their web page, or even just have different kinds of products with different kinds of product web pages, sometimes this code might fail. We'd have to figure out the new CSS selector for that new web page. So you can try adding a try and accept block to this code to gracefully handle any errors that come up, or maybe even just put a debugger breakpoint to see exactly how this failed. But even still, this code will mostly work. So now go to some other websites and try web scraping. I really recommend the National Weather Service at weather.gov, or the webcomic XKCD. You could write some program that would figure out the HTML for this image right here, and then use request to download this image, and then start parsing for this link information to figure out the URL of the previous comic, and then just repeat that, and that way you can repeatedly download all of the images off of this website. So to recap, web pages are plain text files formatted as HTML, and HTML can be parsed with the Beautiful Soup module. Beautiful Soup is imported with the name BS4. You'll have import BS4 as your code. So you can pass the string with the HTML to the bs4.beautifulsoup function to get a soup object. And the soup object has a select method that can be passed a string of the CSS selector for an HTML element. Now you can figure out the CSS selector string yourself if you know the selector string syntax, but an easier way to do it is just use the browser's developer tools by right-clicking an element and selecting Copy CSS Path. And the select method will return a list of matching element objects. Each of these element objects has a text variable with a string of the element's HTML. Each element object has a text variable with a string of that element's HTML.